Hello everyone and welcome. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. We're having some difficulty with the sounds. Last week we did our first Think-ins here in the newsroom and hybrid, and it worked. And so now we think we're amazing and it doesn't work. So we're having a little trouble. So please let us know if if you're joining us at home and you can't hear perfectly, please do say. And likewise, it may be the case that in order to make sure that everyone who's joining us from home can hear you in the newsroom, you may have to speak up a little bit. We're joined by Daisy and Frank and Joe, and I'm going to tell you a little bit, if you like, before we get into the conversation about where this has emerged in our newsroom. So my name's James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise, and I worked before at the BBC and then at the Times. And I remember when I became the editor of the Times, going up for the very first time, and by the way, I should just say to you, a Think-in is normally an open editorial meeting. It's like an open news meeting. This one, for me, is going to feel a little more like therapy, for reasons you're about to discover. So when I became the editor of the Times, I remember going up for the first time to the office of Rupert Murdoch, which was sort of on the other side of the road at the top of the building in Wapping. And I remember walking into his room, one of those rooms, and it's like an office that you think you don't see anymore. It's really big, and it has a bank of newspapers, and the first sort of section of it are his newspapers every day, and they're beautifully positioned one next to the other, the Times and the Sun and the Australian and the New York Post, and you think, how did they get them all here for him at that time in the morning? And then there are also all the other newspapers and all the other periodicals on this large bank. And some of you don't know, he and I haven't been in touch so much recently. We had a bit of a falling out. And a couple of years ago, I was watching Succession. And there's a moment where the camera pans into the office of, what's his name? Logan. And it was exactly the same. It was exactly the same, including the newspapers, the pictures on the walls, the setup of the office. And I had this sort of moment of trauma where I thought, my God, I'm back. And then I thought, how is it that they've got this right? How is it that Frank Rich has got closer to giving you the feeling of what it's like to walk into that office than we in the media have in reporting that story? And I personally, before I joined the Times at the FT, I was the media editor. I wrote Rupert Murdoch stories day in, day out. How is it possible that in the dramatization of a story that I know insists it's nothing to do with the Murdochs, they get closer to it than often we in the news can? And the reason that I'm delighted, I'm really grateful to Frank Cottrell-Boyce and Joe Cottrell-Boyce and to Daisy Grubin too, to be here, is I think that we're trying to get to the same question, which is how do you, whether it's Victoria, whether it's Stephen Lawrence, whether it's any of the other programs we might talk about today, how is it the case that sometimes drama gets to the essence of a story better than journalism? And what does that tell us about the constraints of journalism? What are the risks in terms of the license of drama? And perhaps what's the danger in terms of the blur of the two? So I hope that we will have a conversation. We're hoping that we're going to be able to play, just to begin with, a few of the clips of Stephen. Can we do that, Connor? Or is that feeling, we're going to wait a minute? I'm going to start then, in which case, by hoping that many people will have seen Stephen. Those of us who haven't seen it will be informed by what Frank and Joe say. I'm going to ask, if I might, Frank and Joe to start, and then I'm going to come to you, Daisy, in a moment. Frank, do you want to kick off? Because there's a quote that in our guide that I thought was really revealing, where it said, look, the parents of Stephen Lawrence have realized that, of course, the story was not going to be entirely factual, entirely factually accurate, but they were sufficiently pleased that it told a story that was true at a deeper level. And I wonder how you balance those two things, facts and truth.
Yeah, I think it's important to make the distinction between fact and truth. Although we work very hard to keep this as, and Joe in particular worked very hard to keep this as factual as possible. We have stuck very, very closely to the facts within the legal framework that we were given. I guess, is it about is the essence of this about what state of mind an audience approaches a thing in, that when you're reading a newspaper article or watching the news, you're expecting to be informed about the facts. If you're watching a drama, you're expecting to be moved and to be involved with your whole self emotionally. I mean, obviously the news can be emotional as well, but the kind of the framework that you bring to watching or reading news is basically an information one, whereas the framework that you bring to drama is an emotional one, and that's where the responsibility lies, because obviously if you get it right, then it sticks, whether it's accurate or not. You know, like if you were Richard III's family, you would not be happy with what Shakespeare yeah, and that's ineradicable, isn't it? That cannot be erased, that picture of him. So there's a huge responsibility. You know, you can correct news and you can't really correct drama. I think that's a big difference. I don't know what.
Joe, do you want to just weigh in on this, if you would? Because obviously you were involved, you know, directly in this question, is, as Frank was saying, on how do you actually make sure you are admittedly being truthful, but there is something very important about the facts, because the facts are often messy and get in the way of a clean narrative. So how did you marry those two things?
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting that we're kind of comparing journalism and drama, because we were really fortunate to have Mark Redhead as the producer, who has a background in journalism. And actually, I think I think the starting point really was huge amounts of research and quite following Mark's lead, taking quite a kind of research-led approach to it. I suppose where a lot of playing with the facts really on Stephen was more about kind of changing the order that things happened in, because obviously you're trying to compress, you know, a 6-year investigation into 3 episodes. But I think on a drama like this, it felt particularly important that we didn't kind of completely invent anything, because I think that on a case that has such political significance, it could have undermined the project as a whole. So I think we were really kind of led by that desire to have that rigor, really.
And what do you think? Because one of the questions that arises, I think, often in these dramatisations is that TV drama can only cope with a certain number of characters. And the reality of anything, particularly those things that are criminal or procedural, is that there are many, many different players. Did you merge personalities? Did you create blends of people?
Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the constraints was that, I suppose, what we could portray legally, we're dealing with real people. But I think we were always kind of driven by relationally, but what was happening relationally for the key people, which was Doreen Lawrence and Neville Lawrence, and it felt really important to reflect their experiences. I suppose their experiences interacting with an institution of the Metropolitan Police and the people. That it was important that we preserved their perspective on what was happening in those encounters, even if actually we kind of maybe amalgamated incidents into different characters. But I think that was what was really important to preserve, was their perspective on what was happening to them.
Joe, and sorry, do you want to come back in, Frank?
I've got something I would say, but
far away.
Well, I think there's also a thing about what you pick to tell, which bits of the story you pick to tell is very important as well. I think one of the things that landed really well with an audience was the reenactment of, which did happen, and it's completely accurate the way we've portrayed that. But because we've portrayed that at some length within the episode, we picked that reenactment for dramatic purposes because we knew it would be emotional, because we wanted the murder, but the murder is obviously outside our timeline, but that was a way of presenting an audience with the power, the full kind of brutality of that murder, without having kind of some chunky flashback or a sort of sentimental reminiscence of it. So that I think that's the kind of thing that I was talking about. That there's something that's completely factual, completely in the timeline. We faithfully reproduced it, but we chose it because of its emotional impact and its dramatic value in that it allowed us not to have to mess with the time frame.
So Frank and Joe, pause for a second if you would, because I want to bring in Daisy Goodwin and I want to hear about the writing of Victoria. And maybe you don't want to go back there, Daisy, and the trauma of trying to put that life on screen. But how did you think about the relationship between what we at least quote unquote know in terms of historical fact and storytelling?
Well, I suppose I'd studied Victoria at Cambridge. I was, I did her as a sort of special subject. And I got into it because I read her diaries. And her diaries are a very interesting document because they're not necessarily factual. And I realized as I was reading them that she was kind of the unreliable narrator of her own life. And I found that absolutely fascinating because there's a story there that you have to fill in. And it's not one that's often reflected in the biographies because they're looking at these diaries as fact, whereas of course, as we all know, any of us who keep diaries, we like to kind of leave some things out and put some things in. So I was looking for truth and what I thought had happened. And there's nothing in the series that's not factual. There's nobody who I've made up. I mean, servants. I've made up a few servants because there are literally no records of any of the servants. But I haven't made up, wars that didn't happen, things like that. But what I wanted to do was to give them some emotional ballast because, and also what are the facts that we're interested in about Victoria? Was it about how many documents she signed, or was it about the fact that she hated her mother?
Right.
There are all kinds of things involved in that. And I thought she was a very interesting woman because she's so full of contradictions. And I don't think there was ever a point. I mean, the real pressure, I think, for me about writing about her is there was a sort of feeling that you have to make her sympathetic. And that was always, that kind of jars with some of my feelings about Victoria. But on the other hand, people would always say to me, but she was a terrible mother, wasn't she? And I go, you've never asked if Henry VIII was a bad father.
Right.
So I sort of feel that, one of the things about Victoria, I felt it was slightly my way of doing it was to kind of give her, coming from the perspective of a modern woman.
And Daisy, can I, and this is going somewhere because I'd like to bring both of you, both Joe and Frank and you, Daisy, together around a particular question. But I want to ask one further question about Victoria. And by the way, everyone, please, many people here will know the way our thinking works, particularly Megan and Elena, very nice to see you in person. But many people will know how thinking works. Just put up your hand or put a point in the chat and I'll bring you in. And obviously anyone in the room, please weigh in. So when I started as a reporter, I got called in by the editor because I'd written in a piece, Daisy Goodwin thinks XXX. And the editor had me in and said, we never say thinks. We can't presume to know what a person thinks. You can say what a person said or what a person's done, but you can never write what a person thinks. And of course, the beauty of a drama is that that's exactly what you can presume. And I wonder how you think about that, how you feel that means that we have a better understanding of Victoria and perhaps a less two-dimensional one in drama rather than in history.
The thing that made me really happy after I'd written a couple of episodes of Victoria had gone out, and a history teacher came up to me and she said, you read that episode.
Sorry, you may have to speak up so everyone can hear.
God, you wrote that episode about the Chartists, because I've been talking to my year 8s about the Chartists for a whole year, and now they've seen the show about it. They finally get it. They finally get who the Chartists were, what they wanted, what the deal was, And so you are able to do something like that. The problem with Victoria is that, I think it's very hard to really impress upon, I mean, what you can do in the drama is to show that everyone's bowing and scraping and all the rest of it to her. But I think you can't, I put my truth into Victoria. I've made her the character I think she was. I don't know whether I'm right, but I'm sure there are other people who think she was somebody different. But I've come as close as to what I've seen of Victoria.
So let's imagine. I want to take a sort of hypothetical argument, and I think to myself, okay, we're in the best writers' room we could wish for. We've got you, Daisy. We've got Frank and Joe, and we've just landed the, I don't know, is it 2 million, 4 million an episode commission to do the next series of The Crown? And we're going to do, as this next season of The Crown, we're going to do William and Harry. We're going to do Andrew. We're going to do Charles and Camilla.
Can I just say one thing? I mean, I don't think any television drama will ever equal the drama of the Emily interview.
With Prince Andrew.
Sorry. And let's face it, also the Diana interview, which may or may not have been fiction. So, you know, I do think journalism, we shouldn't forget that, you know, when they put themselves up, blimey.
No, well, we had, when we were doing the notes, by the way, for this Thinking Daisy, there was a, I don't know whether you saw, the 5th slide had this point that the public suggest that there should be, for example, with series like The Crown, a disclaimer. And then there was a point made at this morning's news conference, which was, well, actually, maybe we should put the disclaimer with the journalism. So I think we're alive to the issue.
Well, no, but I think the Prince Andrew one, there was no disclaimer.
No, that's true.
That was
incredible TV, wasn't it? Yeah,
yes,
among other things.
That's the best TV I've seen for a very long time.
But actually, why don't we go all to you? I'll start with you though, Daisy. So let's say you take this set of issues, right? You're going to tell this story. You're going to talk about. Let's start with, for example.
Can I just make one point before we go into that? I think it's too soon, because I don't think you get a drama. I don't think you do a drama about William and Harry and Meghan. I think it's too soon to do that with the. I mean, because there are too many competing narratives. I think what's, you know, Stephen and the Crown so far, the reason they won't go there is that they've had a bit of a chance to kind of regurgitate it. You know, and I think that the reason that the Crown did Diana and Charles so well is because it's a long time ago.
And there's a settled. So okay, well, we've already got someone.
Settled.
So there's a settled. So for drama to deal with what you might think of as news, there needs to have been, in your view, something of a settled narrative.
Well, I think it needs to be, we can rediscover it, because I think if it's all set in people's minds, then you'll just, it's a different thing. But I think, or you're telling a different story. I thought the one about Brexit, you know, the
Dominic Cummings,
the James Graham one was excellent, but the more I see of Dominic Cummings, I don't know whether that was with genius casting done, whether it come from that or not, but it was fascinating. Right. But I think that was probably the best one that was close to the event. But I think really it's much easier, and I think it's better to do it, you know, 5-6 years ago, you know, so you've got that distance. Yeah. Because then the dross sort of falls away naturally.
Let me, Joe and Frank, what do you think? And please do weigh in, everyone. Don't be shy. Joe, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I guess.
Sorry, do unmute yourself. Forgive me.
Sorry. Am I unmuted now?
Yeah.
Oh, it's a lot of feedback. Yeah, I think going back to your kind of hypothetical question, I guess I agree with Daisy. I think it is probably too soon, and I can't imagine kind of writing something about real people where you didn't have the opportunity to actually speak to them, because then it would feel like you're inventing a lot of what they're thinking and their emotional experience. And I think it's too soon for people to be kind of open and vulnerable about a lot of those issues. And I suppose I just interested in the idea about kind of narratives being settled, because I think one of the things that drama can powerfully do is unsettle narratives. I think what part of our ambition with Stephen was to make a drama about institutional racism. I think people have an idea about what institutional racism is, but I guess going back to Frank's point, it's showing the emotional side of that, what it's like to be on the receiving end of a very defensive, a very unempathetic, a very inhumane institution. And I think, bringing that kind of human experience can bring people back to narratives and kind of think about them.
Frank, what do you make of this? Do you think that there has to be, if you like, a breathing space between what happened and drama?
I think Joe's point is more important, that you have to have access to the key players, which is problematic with the royal family, not least because when you do get access to them, they behave in such kind of weird and unpredictable and self-destructive ways, and it seems cruel. But I love Joe's point about unsettling a narrative. You know, we're talking about dramatising news, but of course, journalists dramatise too. You know, we're hosted tonight by Tortoise Media. I am absolutely addicted at the moment to the Tortoise Media Quest for QAnon series, which is a blindingly brilliant piece of storytelling in the way that it's put together. But to go to Daisy's point, like at the other end of that, you have that Harry Meghan thing where the drama is who's a goodie, who's a baddie, and that's it. And that's a drama that's unfolding in real time in the news, on the television, in interviews, on Twitter. That's a drama that everybody's sort of caught up in which they're asked to choose who's the goodie and who's the baddie. And the point of drama is to get beyond that, isn't it? And to find nuance and to find reasons and to provide context. Those are things that drama can do with the immediacy of that kind of media.
But Frank, can I ask you a question? Let's take that example, if I might. I feel as though journalistically, I'll give you one example. We've all been close to a story, which is the process by which William and Harry, as young boys, were asked to walk behind the coffin of their mother. Right? And as responsible journalists, it's really hard to talk about or write about the impact of that moment. We've seen stories, in fact, we've printed, Alistair Campbell wrote about the calls that they had with Prince Charles and the Queen up in Balmoral. The fact that Prince Charles was up in Balmoral is extraordinary. And in the obits for Prince Philip, it turns out that one of the things that Prince Philip said is, look, I appreciate that, this is very difficult to do. Would you be more comfortable if I walked with you? So what we've done is we walked people up to the line of understanding that that choice on that day was an extremely fraught one. And we also begin to understand that, of course, it's had a very, very long shadow, but we can't presume journalistically to say what that shadow is or what its impact is. But it feels as though that's one of the central dramas in the life of that family. And so I wonder where responsible reporting ends and how much we leave open just to inference and presumption and what the extent of the problem of that is. I wonder what you think of that, Frank.
I mean, just going back to that example that you chose, I remember watching The Queen, Peter Morgan's film with the Queen, which I think is right. It's right to say Peter set out with a fairly anti-royalist agenda, but just the demands of drama, of writing drama, are the opposite of what you've just said for journalism, that you can't presume to, in journalism, you can't presume to guess what people are thinking. In drama, you're kind of obliged to have the thought experiments that people might have their reasons, and you have to have that. That is what drama is. What drama is allowing you to think that you might possibly be wrong, to bring you inside and stop you from, and prevent you from having that kind of external judgment. So that in the end, the Queen film was relatively sympathetic to those kind of decisions, about being in Balmoral and about not flying the flag at half-mast. I asked you to consider that these people might think differently from the way that you do.
Frank, I just want to bring my colleague Kerry Thomas. I'll come to you in a moment, Yelena. Kerry's here. I hope you can hear, but you might have to speak up, Kerry.
Okay, I'll do my best. So I love Succession. I love Stephen. I think these things are really important. In a previous life, before it all went wrong, I used to get a Panorama, and it used to have to make weekly half-hour things, but also occasionally you go and pitch a longer thing, an hour or 90 minutes to the controller of BBC One. And because I've always loved ambiguity in things, I used to try and pitch sort of grey things to Charlotte Morley, it was at the time. And I think if my hit rate wasn't 0, it was like really close to it. And at the end of these pitches, she would generally say to me, have you it's a lovely story, but have you thought of doing this as a drama? And what she meant by that at the time was that I felt that TV journalism, or long form TV journalism, was really uncomfortable with ambiguity or uncertainty. And I suppose my little worry coming at this from a journalist point of view rather than a storyteller's point of view, like Frank and Daisy and Joe, is that is there a risk in this that we've lost our ability to cope with uncertainty, that we've lost an understanding that there's some things you can't get to journalistically, that actually sometimes you just have to accept that there's not an answer that can be got to neatly. There's a question of neatness, I think, in television that sometimes I think is a problem for journalism, because not everything is neat.
And there's an interesting thing just worth reflecting on, that Kerry, just telling people about, which is the process we're now seeing. You mentioned, Frank, the QAnon series, Finding Q, and what the expectations in the podcasting world are of drama in factual reporting. We had a process where we were pitching a story to Spotify. Do you want to just talk about that? And I just remember that meeting where they said, in this story, it was about corporate espionage, who do you care about? And it was really interesting. We cared about the abuse of power, but they didn't want the abuse of power unless there was clearly an individual victim or an individual whose life had been twisted and turned by it. And I wonder, because Kerry, you're doing more of this now, how you think that drama is changing what's expected of journalism.
So I think it was interesting to hear Joe say, there was a strong journalistic input into Stephen. A friend of mine just wrote the Salisbury Killings. He was a journalist on Panorama. He's moved across. So there's definitely an interplay, and I think in many ways it's good for journalism, because actually the sort of quest for narrative has been stronger in America than it's been in this country, I think, over a long period. So I think that discipline of saying, right, who are we going to care about? How are you going to carry people through this thing? A lot of that is really positive, and I completely welcome it. I think one of the reasons I'm loving the kind of podcast surge at the moment is I think there's a greater willingness to embrace uncertainty and complexity in podcasts than there used to be in television, and I think I can see podcasts beginning to change some of those old habits in television and make them more open to those kind of things. So I can see a lot of really positive things going on, but I just worry about that sort of quest to put a ribbon around things when sometimes there's not a ribbon at hand.
I'm going to come back to Frank and Joe and Daisy in a moment, but I want to hear from Yelena and I want to hear from Andrew Girdwood, who's made a point about the audience. So Yelena.
Yeah, very briefly, I graduated last year, but when I did I studied politics, but I did my dissertation on the use of satire in Tito's Yugoslavia as a means of unsettling the regime and also articulating the regime. And I remember getting a very, very curt email from the librarian when I ordered all the books in, and I was told that these books aren't sources, I couldn't possibly need them for my degree, and that the library service is a pleasure reading.
It's a whole other thinking on libraries, and the problem with libraries there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to be fair, they were books, they were very much kind of Animal Farm style satire, so I can kind of understand where they might have been coming from. But when I was doing all the research around it, I came across really interesting things about the role of literature and fiction, and it's got a kind of seductive power that encourages you to put yourself in someone else's shoes and to unsettle your expectations. And I think that's what Joe was talking about earlier. And I wanted to ask you then where you kind of draw the distinction then when you're talking about these non-fiction events, but you're fictionalizing them, and also whether there's a sense of responsibility there, because ultimately there will be students in many years' time who might come to things like Succession or to Stephen as historical sources who might be wanting to write their dissertation. So where do you kind of see the role of media in having a responsibility that way too?
Daisy, do you want to?
I'd say that drama is drama, and obviously if you're dealing with living people, you have a responsibility towards them, just as you do for making a documentary about them, which I've done many things like that, and you have to portray them fairly. But I do think that to have the idea of having a warning on the crowd saying this is fiction, it seems to me so extraordinary, because of course it's fiction. I mean,
But Daisy, can I ask you this? In a kind of, if you have a sort of intimate romantic moment in a historical drama, I think we as an audience think, well, who knows what actually happened there. If you have an interchange between sort of people of state, you think, oh, that must be close to the truth. And I wonder, in the writing of it, just to Elaine's point, are there kind of gradations of imagination that you bring to this?
Yes, but I mean, what you're really imagining, I mean, it's different. I mean, I'm talking about the 19th century, and in a sense, it's no one's alive.
Fair game.
But I think that, when I'm imagining what Palmerston would say in a given moment, I'm probably thinking a little bit of Boris Johnson, adding in, slightly more sense, and thinking of how he might have done it, because you have to kind of characterize people, and you have to think what they would have been like. So that's the way I do it. But I wouldn't have him starting a war he didn't start, but honestly, you don't need to, because there's so much in the past that is never talked about because it's no longer interesting. There's one narrative. And with Victoria and Albert, there were so many fascinating things that people didn't know about and are never talked about. When Albert falls through the ice and practically drowns in Windsor Castle. I mean, that was amazing. It's never talked about. And I thought, well, that's a moment of drama that I can put in my thing. So, just because it's, you're trying to find an alternative history really that you like, really, that you find interesting, that you think people would find interesting. But it's, I mean, I suppose what I do with Victoria, I was trying to turn her from a sort of old haddock, into what she was, a young woman. A young woman, of course, at 18 who wakes up one day, she's the most powerful woman in the world, and that's an extraordinary thing. So that was the point of that drama.
I do think the point, by the way, about Albert falling in through the ice, there is something too in what journalists think of as stories and what we as people believe are important. One of the things we often talk about here is that it's clearly the case that the Beatles are probably more interesting than Harold Wilson. But if you were reading a paper, 40, 50 years ago, you would have read much more about Harold Wilson than the Beatles. So there's something to the stories we get wrong. I'm going to just, if I might, come to Joe and Frank, just because I don't know whether you saw the question, which I'm completely fascinated by, from Maurizio. I'm going to pronounce your name wrong, forgive me, Maurizio Alencar, which is, what are the legal requirements on drama as distinct from the legal requirements on journalism when it comes to, I imagine, things like libel, privacy, etc. Joe, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess they're similar, I suppose. I think we have a bit of leeway by putting that kind of slightly annoying warning at the beginning, saying this is a drama, but we can't, when we're depicting real people, we can't just make things up. But I guess, in that grey area is when you kind of invent, where it's a fairly contentious area of our history, we can use kind of invented characters to depict real events.
For TV than it is for film. So if you're
Why?
doing a biopic, I don't know why, but if you're doing a biopic, I mean, I've been writing something about Maria Callas. If you're doing Maria Callas, you've got to get it right in a way that you wouldn't have to if it was a movie.
Because of the TV.
There is a in this country there is a kind of, yes, I think there is more of an obligation to be accurate than there is the movies.
I said we'll hear from Andrew Girdwood. Andrew, are you there? Because you were making a point about our willful failure to actually talk about the audience in any of this.
Yes, that's a bit harsh for me, but I think it's true, because I don't think you could control it. The lens by which people view your stories or your truth is not something you control, but it's really important. So if I'm watching a documentary or a dramatization, I've made the choice. I've preemptively given you an hour or more of my time, and I know there'll be payoff. I know you are layering it on and you're building it up, and it may not be entirely % true, but if I think it's a dramatization, I know that the broad strokes are true. And so you've got much greater leeway with me. But when it comes to news content, you don't have that. You're moral utility. You're almost interruptive. I have endless news stories to pick, and well, this is very tortoise, isn't it? You have to earn for me the stories I want to investigate further. And it seems to be that you do that by saying, this is why it's important. You tell me the important stuff first. And if I'm still interested, then I get to read on. And I think in that scenario, when I bring that lens and that way, I decide what your content should do and how it needs to be structured. No wonder they're different. But I just don't think, so I think the audiences are the deciders here.
Interesting. I'm gonna bring in, I've got a thought on that, Andrew, but I want to bring in my colleague Claudia, because, well, I don't know what you want to say, Claudia, far away.
Well, I have to make a kind of similar point that Andrew made, but one of the things that I'm quite interested in this is, again, about audiences, but kind of about media literacy, because I do think there's a real problem with how we consume media and how, I think particularly if you're talking about journalism and news, I know that I've spoken to a huge number of people who don't actually understand the difference between comments and news reporting, or what an editorial is, and kind of read it all as one and assume it's all comes from the same place and wouldn't necessarily understand the role of opinion in comment. And I do think there is a similarity there with how people view TV, as if it's all part of kind of a spectrum. And obviously, if you're switching onto a drama, you know that it's TV, but I think you can't, as Andrew said, you can't decide how someone's going to receive that. And if they're really engaged, that might be what sticks in their brain. And 5-10 years later, that's what they remember.
But of course, Claudia, the biggest complaint of all is when journalists purport to report, but actually editorialize, bring their opinion. And I just wondered whether or not, sparing your blushes, Claudia did an amazing story a few months back called Cross Stitch. I don't know whether anyone had a chance to listen to it, right? But if we're honest with ourselves, and this was a story about a fist fight in the embroidery world. Is it called the Embroiderers Guild, right? Was there any moment when, in the telling of that story, Claudia, you thought, calendar girls? You thought, I know what the movie is of this particular piece of reporting, and so there's something that's a dramatic pull, and rather than doing something that's reporting, you find yourself leaning towards a dramatization.
Yeah, of course, you have those reference points that you're thinking, this is my vision board for this podcast.
Right.
I think that's partly the nature of podcasting, is that you're thinking about things in terms of cliffhangers and where are the points of drama, and it is quite similar to TV writing in a sense, that how can I reveal this story in the most kind of interesting way? But I think that the kind of difference, or the kind of guiding principle of it all, is what can we say that is true and accurate and fair? And you have a responsibility to your audience, and you have a responsibility to the real people that you're talking about, and the real situation that you are, yes, telling a story about, but ultimately analysing, to keep that within the frame of reality and not let the kind of vision board of camera the sense and the tone overtake that.
Sorry, Daisy, yeah.
One thing I wanted to say is, and I wonder if Frank and Joe agree with me, is that the thing, when you dramatise the story, you use actors. And, even if it's a really unsympathetic part, you've got Stephen Tennant playing,
Yes.
serial killer. That makes a difference, because even if you don't like him, you're mesmerised because it's David Tennant or whoever it is. So I do think that's another thing that perhaps we're not taking into account, which is that, no matter how unsympathetic you want to make the Queen, if you've got, a national treasure playing her like Helen Mirren, that's not the way it's going to be. It's not going to resonate like that with the audience.
Can I ask you, Frank, you a question about this, which is, I appreciate Daisy's point, which is if you put a celebrity in a certain role, I, as the audience, I'm going to, almost despite myself, have some sympathy. But I don't know whether you saw this. There was a really, really smart piece of reporting on the media by Ben Smith, who was the New York Times media editor, used to run BuzzFeed. And it was quite an aggressive piece about Ronan Farrow, Ronan Farrow had led some of the best Me Too coverage. And the argument that Ben Smith made was that when you looked at some of the reporting, what he thought he saw was what he called resistance journalism, i.e. that Ronan Farrow had taken the side of women who had been abused and harassed, to the point where in some of the instances, the facts hadn't been checked because he was already on the side of the survivors, the victims. And I guess the question I've got for you is that when you're telling a drama about a real life situation, you're not seeking to be even-handed. The kind of thing that Ben Smith is having a go at Ronan Farrow for is actually part of the, I imagine, the texture and the force of the drama. And so how do you think about that responsibility to the awkward facts?
Well, that's such a great question. Can I pick up a few different threads to bring to bear on that? Because you talked a few minutes ago about, oh, sorry, it was Kerry, I think, talked about tying a ribbon on things and how television wanted sympathy and clarity, and how, you know, real news is ambiguous and conflicted in exactly the way that you're talking about that Me Too coverage. And I think I would go back to Joe's great phrase there about unsettling the narrative. We think through stories. Stories are the software that we bring to interpret the world. How many of us have made decisions based on the idea that this idea or this person is an ugly duckling, or this new innovation is Frankenstein? You know, we have these kind of shorthand that is narrative. And I think as a dramatist, your responsibility, which I admit is often not adhered to and often goes the other way, but the dream, you know, the responsibility, the ideal, is to unsettle the narrative, whether you're writing something that's framed as drama or whether you're doing something as Claudia did so wonderfully with Cross Stitch, where when you're listening to Cross Stitch, you can hear, you said Calendar Girls, you can hear the ghost of those kind of narratives in the background. And at the same time, you can see Claudia pushing against them. So it's that thing of like, I think this is beyond journalism versus drama. We are living in a world where on social media, we're constantly being asked to sub things down to the binary, you know, to Harry versus Will or whatever, you know, that everything is sort of binary choices. And I think drama, whether that's drama is framed as a cracking podcast or as a piece of TV drama, what it can do, it doesn't always do, but what it can do is unsettle the narrative, ask you to, as Rilke says, live inside the question rather than try to sub it down to the answer.
And Frank, can I just ask you about a different element of this? So one of the criticisms of journalism is that we're very good at events, but we're very bad at developments, things that happen over time.
Yeah.
Right? And actually part of the thing that we tried to do in setting up Tortoise was say, okay, well, how would you think about a newsroom that was focused on those things that happen over time? So our obsessions around things like the planet, the 100-year life, capital, a lot of these things are really big and they're not dramatic. And I wonder whether in the commissioning meetings that you have, when you go and you speak to people, they say, look, we really need to do a climate thing, but my God, it's difficult to land a story. Or, you know what, I'm worried about the accountants. And you're like, yeah, that's great, but it's not a brilliant story. You know, do you worry that when you think about the sort of social responsibility of drama, that there's just a bunch of stuff that no one's ever going to get close to?
Hugely. And I think, yes, absolutely. I'm constantly thinking about that, you know, that is a failure within art generally, that it just is rubbish at dealing with those big things. And it would be great to, you know, whenever I hear this drama or whatever pushes the envelope, I know what that envelope is going to be. It's going to be around mores, around swearing or sexuality. It's never going to be about how hunger works or how global warming works. Those are not the envelopes that anybody wants to push. And they are really, really difficult because we're humans and we see each other through the eyes of other human beings, you know, and we're interested in other human beings and we're basically not interested in plate tectonics. But I do think that's a failure of imagination. You should get a science fiction writer on for the next one, maybe.
or I don't know about that, but I'm looking forward to the Patisserie Valerie accounting scandal in 6 dramatic episodes.
Sorry, you're looking at someone who spent years pitching that Vincent O'Teal book, Shiver Fools.
Yes. Yes.
Absolutely did.
bring.
But it wasn't on TV.
True, but it's drama.
Yeah, no, it was definitely drama. It was brilliant, but it wasn't on TV.
Yeah, but it should.
Yes,
Is that translated to TV?
I'm not sure it would have got the audience. That's the problem. I think you can take those risks.
Yeah,
in
on
live
stage.
theatre.
Yeah. Just to this point about unsettling the narrative, I really worry about things like Stillwater, which resettle the wrong narrative. So if you think about the sort of the way the amount.
Tess, I've got to forget.
Sorry,
I haven't
okay.
seen it. Sorry.
No, I haven't seen it yet, but.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. Now I'm feeling better.
Stopped us.
No, no. Yeah.
No, but,
So what is it?
it's the inspired by Amanda Knox.
Oh, I
Matt
see.
Damon film.
Yes.
I've not actually seen it. It's not out yet. Is it?
No.
Anyway, but there's been.
This is where journalism really does meet drama. We all discuss something we haven't seen. Let's go.
But the point is that it is already, and Amanda Knox is sort of trying
Yes,
to
yes.
reclaim her own narrative, because her argument, as far as I understand it from the things I've read about it, is that it's settling a narrative that's wrong. So it's starting from the wrong point. It's got an entirely wrong basis of fact from a legal perspective about her ever being charged with, and it's the Amanda Knox. It's and to your point, Daisy, about what you can get away with in film versus telly, it seems to be full of incredibly sort of fancy footwork when it comes to its positioning, and it is telling her story, and she is powerless in this. As a Matt Damon blockbuster settles the narrative, starts the narrative from a point that's not factually correct. So it is absolutely cementing the Amanda Knox stories wrongly. And she has no voice in this other than a single voice to say this just isn't right. She's up against studios, directors, giving interviews.
But Tess, there's an element of this. I don't know. You may not have been in the meeting that Kerry and I were having, which was around what happens when newsrooms start thinking about the longer shelf life of a story as it moves from a piece of reporting to a podcast to potentially a TV series, and the expectation that those people who produce TV series want you to, quote unquote, buy up the IP, to buy the rights to the lives of those people, and the inevitable conflict of interest that is. So on the one hand, I hear what you say about Amanda Knox, but I'm actually quite relieved that the people who are telling the story are not, if you like, economically in step with Amanda Knox. Gives me a little more hope that they'll actually tell the story independently. I don't know, actually, Joe, I'm interested to know whether or not, for example, in the case of Stephen, you had to, quote unquote, buy up the life rights of people involved in the story.
I mean, again, going back, I think we were really lucky to have Mark Redhead, who had, I guess not so much about buying the rights, but also winning the trust of the Lawrence family, and also Clive Driscoll. But if I can, I just want to come back a bit to the really interesting discussion about kind of narratives and audience, because I think one of the things that's interesting about the case of Stephen Lawrence is that in the initial days and weeks after Stephen's murder, there was a very familiar narrative of what it means when a black boy is murdered. There was the usual tropes about, oh, he was involved in drug dealing, all the rest of it. These were put out by the police, and initially that was kind of accepted. And one thing that's amazing about Stephen Lawrence's story is that a marginalized narrative about a grieving black family managed to break into the mainstream. But those other narratives still persist, and they persisted within the police, but they also exist in the public, and that is in our audience. You can see on social media, people still push conspiracy theories about Stephen being a drug dealer. This was nothing to do with race. This was all, the usual racist conspiracy theories are pushed out there. And it felt really important to put those narratives into the drama as well, to show, I guess, the function that these competing narratives play in our society. Because really, what do narratives like that do? They work against empathy. They make you think, don't care about that black boy who's dead because he had it coming. He's not the person we should be caring about. And I think there's something we heard from police, the kind of the lines that are in the drama are real lines. They're things that police officers we interviewed told us their colleagues had said to them, but you could find almost verbatim things on Twitter, on Facebook, in reaction to press releases about Stephen. So it's fascinating how these narratives persist. And I think we really wanted to kind of capture the tension between these different narratives in the drama itself as well.
I just wanted to press one further point though on this unsettling the narrative. If you wanted to do something really heretical, Joe, if you wanted to tell the story of, let's say, the MMR vaccines and take the position of Andrew Wakefield, that goes against the science and goes against what people publicly think, but is a story about a person in that context. It's nonetheless a story, it's a drama, definitely. Do you think that you can responsibly do that? Do you have to put aside a certain amount of your freedom of speech and storytelling when you're speaking to a mass audience because of the responsibility of telling drama on television?
I mean, I guess, to me, it comes down to balancing different narratives. I think it's, it'd be interesting to tell a story about Andrew Wakefield and what was, I guess one of the things about drama is you can spend a bit more time on the kind of the messiness and the complicated motivations people have. But I think there's been plenty of examples of very irresponsible dramas that feed into, either feed into kind of dominant discourses or feed into, really, really unhelpful. I think years ago there was something about, satanic ritual abuse that was very much kind of on the side of people who were pushing those kind of conspiracy theories at the time. And I think that can do a lot of damage because they have staying power and they can echo back and kind of continue to influence quite toxic narratives that are out there in society.
Yeah.
Produced by Monica, because that's a story. Boy, is that a story that needs a narrative that needs unsettling. But
Daisy, there's an interesting story there. We tried to do a series of podcasts about Monica because we thought there was an amazing story there about the sort of precursor of trolling and all of those things. And what happened was, this is about buying up IP. She won't speak to anyone now because she's in a position, or maybe not anyone, maybe she just wouldn't speak to us, but she wouldn't speak to us because at this stage, her focus is on the telling of her story. And so I think there's also an issue here, which is the way in which that Netflix platform or the Spotify platforms now change the terms of trade in terms of the way in which you interview people in the public eye.
Yes, I'm sure. I mean, there was a slow burn podcast, wasn't there?
Yeah.
About the Clinton scandal, which was fantastic. And I'm really, really looking forward to this. In the light of Me Too, that's a story.
Amazing.
That has to be retold.
I just want to come to Luke, my colleague.
If I could, I think there might be something worth mentioning that links what Frank was saying about the sort of persistent sort of reduction down to binaries and having to be comfortable with one decision or the other, and also with the idea that you raised about sort of the time depth for things to settle and become, which is that some of this stuff is still very much alive in the political decisions that people make today. So that binary can literally be a vote between one party or another, or that binary is a referendum decision, yes or no. And being mindful of the fact, I'm thinking of Stephen here, like the ideas that people have with them could well be informed by this drama, but be very much alive in the political decisions that they make and the choices that they have in their workplace or whatever it is. And I think that's why we have to be so mindful of news as a tool for helping people to be citizens. And I don't know if we've really sort of puzzled out whether drama on television is also a tool for people to be citizens. I don't know.
It's really interesting.
How would you do that? What would be the link?
Well, that's what I'm not sure about, but something like The Crown certainly plays into whether this sort of Republican sentiment is more dominant in the UK, or whether we should be sympathetic to all of the economic and political issues that go along with the monarchy. But does it have a license to be that? In the way I think that news, with its history and a certain amount of regulation and stuff, does have a license to do it. I'm not sure, but I thought that was worth mentioning.
Yeah. Before we finish, Frank, do you have any final thoughts to kind of send us thoughtfully on our way?
I think the thing that really landed me when Joe said that those narratives license you not to care, and drama is always an invitation to care, and that invitation to care could be used irresponsibly, but that you have to know what the power of it is. And the power of it is it invites you to care about somebody. And so that's my big takeaway. I love to Joe's point about, you know, those narratives around Stephen's death were dismissive.
Joe?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Yeah, I mean, I think, I suppose, I guess with the experience of writing Stephen, I think it was trying to make it kind of an attempt at empathy. And I think, you know, that word can be thrown around, but actually empathy can be quite hard work, really trying to understand what kind of the emotional experiences and the motivations of the people involved were. I think good drama, you know, can translate that empathy. But so can good journalism. I think maybe it's a bit of a false dichotomy. I think you know, there is very good journalism and different forms of journalism. We were talking about podcasts before, that invite you to kind of step into someone else's shoes. And there's good and bad. There's bad drama and bad journalism that just kind of reinforces, quite shallow understandings.
Joe, thank you. I'm going to give Daisy you the last word. What from the position of a dramatist, do you think should be the injunction to the invitation to journalists?
Well, I think journalists, you know, are trying to report the news, tell people what happened, but inevitably they're making choices. My husband used to work for an American news organisation, which is owned by a bigger fictional organisation, which may or may not have cast members, and there was definitely an expectation that they would tell their stories. You know, their stories would have a beginning, middle, and an end. So I think, you know, television news is in its way as crafted, you know, in its miniature way as crafted as drama. But I think what the advantage of drama is, you can have ambiguity, you can have empathy, you can have all these things that you don't have. I personally would like to see less dramas about serial killers, and I'd like to see more dramas, you know, which, you know, whether they're true or not, but I think they are pandering to a certain type of, you know, they're pandering to a certain kind of trope. And I'd like to see more dramas like that Danish one, which about the submarine killer, where you never saw the victim, you never saw the killer. And I thought that was extraordinary.
Yes.
And I thought that was a really clever new way of shifting the audience's focus from the evil man to the, you know, to the painstaking work that it takes to, you know, bring someone like that to justice.
Well, listen, on that note, it's partly also, isn't it, about the thrill of seeing someone tell a very, very complicated story well without falling into the cliched traps we often fall into. I wanted to say a few thank yous just before we go. Firstly, for a lot of people here, I hope you've heard everything. For a lot of people at home, I know you were struggling sometimes with the sound. But the people who really made sure that actually this whole thing went out at all were my colleagues Connor and Seb. And a big thank you to you, because there's nothing quite as fun as the sound going down at 29 minutes past the hour. So thank you very much for making it work. The thing about this, that I think there is going to be more of an argument around this issue than we probably expect at the moment, because there is going to be more scrutiny of drama as the big increase in dramatisations means that people apply a set of standards to drama that hasn't previously been the case. And I think there is also going to be an issue in journalism where the tug of dramatisations has an impact on the stories we choose and the way we tell them. So I think this blurring is something to watch. But weirdly, I actually come away really quite upbeat about it all, because first and foremost, it's an explosion of storytelling. To your point, Frank, this issue, which is centrally stories, matters. And I really take the point that Joe and Daisy made to heart, which is the unsettling of the narrative, right? The business of telling people things that they didn't know, that is truly revealing, that joins us both as dramatists and journalists. And I love the invitation to care. I do think that that's something that is beholden on journalism too. If you are really interested in power and justice, you should be giving people invitation to care. And the thing that I'm going to probably take home and think about the most is the point that you made. I'll go and read up my Rilke, Frank, but the idea that we should live the questions and rather than presume the answer seems like an invitation for the sort of slightly more complicated life that Kerry suggested. So a big thank you to all of you, for those people who've come to our Thinking in our newsroom for the first time. But most of all, whether you're at home or here, please join me in giving a round of applause to Daisy, to Joe, and to Frank. Thank you very much.